In this talk, I will be dealing with the developmental considerations of sexual abuse. Childhood abuse survivors are our friends and neighbors, our colleagues, and sometimes even ourselves or members of our own families. Child sexual abuse is a crime with significant implications for child victims, adult survivors, and the community at large. A meta-analysis of 65 prevalence studies covering 22 countries found that 19.7% of women and 7.9% of men had experienced child sexual abuse before the age of 18. Children's normative tendency to blame themselves for negative experiences involving adults prevent them from talking about it for many years. This leaves many female survivors believing that they are bad people who are responsible for the abuse. The stigma attached to sexual abuse contributes to some female survivors' perceptions of themselves as damaged goods. It creates an ambivalence about their bodies and reticence to seek care for health problems. They are often socialized to be submissive. For a man to acknowledge that he has been sexually abused is an admission of vulnerability in a society that has few models for the expression of masculine vulnerability. Even caregivers are skeptical about men who disclose sexual abuse and tend to take their experiences less seriously than those of their female counterparts. Some of the barriers to disclosure in males are issues regarding masculinity. They are unable to name the experience or display internal emotions. And there is always the issue with sexual orientation. Some other interpersonal relations or reasons could be mistrust, fear of being labeled as gay, and past responses to revelation where they have confided in somebody and that person has not believed them. There could also be safety and protection issues. Studies show that child maltreatment has high economic costs in medical expenses, legal costs, and lost productivity. The consequences can also last a lifetime. Adults who were abused or neglected as children have a higher risk of perpetrating or being a victim of violence, depression, obesity, high-risk sexual behaviors and unintended pregnancies, and harmful use of tobacco, drugs, alcohol, among many other long-term effects of violence. Abuse can teach children to avoid speaking up or questioning authority figures. In adulthood, survivors may then have difficulty expressing their needs to a caregiver who is perceived as an authority figure. There are various theoretical understandings of abuse development which try to explain how abuse develops. Some of them include the biological, physiological, neuro-moral, psychological, and moral theories of development, among others. They all serve to give an understanding of how the early developmental years of a child is very important and the care that needs to be taken in attending to the developmental needs of a growing child. All of these theories mention antisocial behavior, of which sexual abuse is one of them. I will now speak about a few of the antisocial behaviors based on biological models and why these antisocial behaviors develop. There are some biological models which talk about levels of arousal within individuals or psychophysiology, which have become important biological explanations for antisocial and criminal behavior. Biologically, this is measured through heart rate and skin conductance, or the sweat rate. This is thought of as being because of blunted autonomic functioning. Antisocial individuals, due to their blunted autonomic functioning, are not deterred from criminal behavior. This is because they do not experience appropriate physiological responses to risky or stressful situations, nor potential aversive consequences, and therefore this is called the fearless hypothesis. We also have the sensation-seeking hypothesis, which suggests that in order to achieve homeostasis, individuals engage in antisocial behavior to raise their arousal levels. Also, the failure to cognitively associate physiology responses with emotional states could also result in criminal behaviors. If an individual is unable to experience or label somatic changes and connect them to relevant emotional experiences, they might risk inappropriate behavior. This is the somatic marker hypothesis. Psychopathic individuals exhibit somatic aphasia, which is the inaccurate identification and recognition of one's bodily state, and therefore they do something which is inappropriate. It has also been seen that in persons with antisocial behavior, there are structural defects in the brain. Structural aberrations and functional impairments in the prefrontal cortex have been typically associated with conventional criminal behavior. The prefrontal cortex is considered the seat of higher level cognitive processes such as decision making, attention, emotional regulation, impulse control, and moral reasoning. Larger prefrontal structures have been associated with better executive functioning in healthy adults. However, structural deficits and functional impairments of the prefrontal cortex have been observed in antisocial and criminal individuals, suggesting that prefrontal cortex aberrations may underlie some of the observed behaviors. An important theory to consider is the neuro-moral theory. The neuro-moral theory of antisocial behavior indicates that the diverse brain regions impaired in offenders overlap significantly with brain regions involved in moral decision-making. The key areas implicated in both moral decision-making and the spectrum of antisocial behaviors include the frontopolar, medial and ventral prefrontal cortex regions, and the anterior cingulate, amygdala, insula, superior temporal gyrus, and angular gyrus or the temporoparietal junction. This theory provides a way of understanding how impairments to different brain regions can converge on the concept of impaired morality, a core to many different forms of antisocial behaviors. Impaired autonomic functioning and reduced emotional intelligence may impede the treatment of psychopathology. This impaired development can disrupt development of moral emotions such as shame, guilt, and empathy. There are many types of antisocial behavior. Sexual abuse is one of them. The theories I just spoke about are about antisocial behavior development at the biological or the psychophysiological level. Other types of antisocial behaviors include physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, domestic abuse, bullying, among others. What I will now talk about is sexual abuse from the development psychology perspective. There is clinical and theoretical support for the link between poor parental attachment and sexual offending, but there is insufficient empirical evidence. Poor parental bonding enhances the effects of child maltreatment by creating vulnerability in the child, a lack of empathy for others, or intimacy deficits. Intrafamilial child sexual abusers likely regard their mothers as unloving, inconsistent, and abusive, whereas rapists, who are considered extrafamilial abusers, were more likely to regard their fathers as uncaring and abusive. An avoidant paternal attachment was related to coercive sexual behavior. Another group is that of child sexual abusers in the workplace. Clergy sexual abusers were put in the category of child sexual abusers in the workplace. Insecure attachment bonds impair the ability to develop sufficient social skills and self-esteem necessary to achieve intimacy with adults. Insecure attachments can lead to distorted beliefs regarding self, others, and relationships, and can result in the acquisition of maladaptive personal problem solving. These developmental factors can interact with disinhibiting factors like intoxication, stress, negative affect, to impair an individual's ability to control his or her behavior, which in turn may result in sexual offense. Child sexual abusers reported more frequent experiences of child sexual abuse, early exposure to pornography, sexual activities with animals, and an earlier onset of masturbation. Rapists reported more frequent experiences of physical abuse, emotional abuse, parental violence, and cruelty to animals. Both child sexual abusers and rapists reported frequent exposure to violent media during their childhood. A substantial majority of child sexual offenders are involved more generally in criminal activity. Many child sexual offenses may therefore be explained as extensions of more general antisocial patterns of behavior, perhaps involving opportunism, the exploitation of interpersonal relationships, or the disregard of socially accepted codes of behavior. Two studies, the John J. Collins study, which was done on Catholic priests who abused in the United States of America, and the Wortley and Smallbone study, which was a study on the general population sexual abusers who were incarcerated, looked at situational indicators of sexual abuse. A comparison of the two studies showed many similarities in the statistics. One of the comparisons was on situations of opportunity. The John Jay study showed that 41% committed abuse in parish residences, 12.4% committed abuse in the victim's home, and 17.8% committed abuse during travel. The Wortley and Smallbone study showed that 68.9% of non-clerics or the general population committed abuse in the offender's residence, 19.5% committed abuse in the victim's home, and 20% committed abuse on an overnight trip. On comparing the two studies, it is noticed that the percentage of offenses committed at the offender's residence was far higher for the general population than for the clergy offenders, but were close for offenses committed at the victim's home and those committed during travel or an overnight trip. This brings in an interesting factor about clergy offenders versus offenders in the general public, that is, child sexual abusers intrafamilial and child sexual abusers extrafamilial and child sexual abusers in the workplace. More abuse occurs in families than outside of families. It is thought that child sexual abusers in the workplace may show less antisocial tendencies or fewer indicators for psychopathic traits when compared to child sexual abusers intrafamilial and child sexual abusers extrafamilial. It was found that there was a lower prevalence of antisocial personality disorder in clergy child sexual abusers compared to other child sexual abusers. This could be because maintaining a profession or a position in a social organization in which one is entrusted with the supervision and care of children usually requires distinctly pro-social attitudes and behaviors. It was also seen that child sexual abusers in the workplace had substantially less previous convictions involving a sexual or violent offense and had spent less time in prisons previous to the index offense compared to the other two groups. In conclusion, whatever be the various theories for the development of child sexual abuse, it is important to realize that early childhood is an important time in the development of a child, and the utmost care should be taken to nurture children during that time.